In this little video, I'm going to talk about one of the major rivals of moral realism, namely error theory. I'll get to error theory in just a moment, but first I wanted to go ahead and say some preliminary things and introductory things about the course. So to begin, allow me to welcome you to the course. I've been greatly looking forward to it, and I hope that it turns out to be a good experience for each one of you in equipping you to do the work you've been called to do. So I am, as I say, Dave Baggett, and I teach here at Houston Baptist. I've been here about a year. I was at my previous school for about 14, and the school before that I was at for about 4 years. After I earned my PhD in philosophy. And enjoying HBU, I largely came here in order to be the director of the Center for Moral Apologetics, which I recently renamed to the Center for the Foundations of Ethics. And that's an important part of what we're doing here at HBU. And for those who are interested in taking more than just a class on theistic ethics and moral apologetics, we'll actually be starting next summer of 2021. I don't even know what year this is. This is 2021, maybe 2022. The certificate program in moral apologetics. And so if you have any interest in that, we can talk some more about it. But when you hear the term moral apologetics, by the way, you might not know entirely what that means, but basically means issues pertaining to the moral argument or the moral arguments for God's existence. And we'll be looking at a number of those this term. And if those arguments are right, then morality has its foundations in God, and we think otherwise to our detriment and to the detriment of ethics. And in fact, I think we see quite a bit of this in our culture today, an erosion of the moral foundations, because the efforts to found morality on other things, I'm inclined to think, are rather bound to fail. At any rate, I'm very interested in these topics, and I'm greatly looking forward to going through this class with you. I think it's important that we begin this class with a consideration of moral realism, largely because any efforts to push or advance or promote the moral argument for God's existence is likely to be predicated on something like moral realism, which is the view that some things are really right and some things are really wrong, and some things are good, some things are evil. And it's hard to construct a moral argument for God's existence unless you start here. As it happens, my colleague Jerry Walls here at HBU, my former professor at Asbury Seminary years and years ago, and my dear friend, he and I have written 3 books together on the moral argument. We started with writing around 2011 a book called Good God, and that's a requirement for this class. 2016 we wrote God and Cosmos. 2019 we came out with The Moral Argument of History. That's required in this class as well. And we're now working on the 4th in this Tetralogy, and it's actually a book defending moral realism. So that's a project in progress, and it's an increasingly important issue in our society. Some important books written on the subject of moral realism lately include Russ Schaefer Landau's Moral Realism and Defense, and David Enoch's Taking Morality Seriously, A Defense of Robust Realism. Neither of those guys happen to be Christians, but they're good philosophers, and they wrote some good books there. A much more accessible book, by the way, by Schaefer Landau on these topics is called Whatever Happened to Good and Evil. I considered making that a requirement in this class, but decided against it. And then Terence Cuneo, who actually is a Christian, has written 2 books of his own defending moral realism. One is called The Normative Web, an Argument for Moral Realism. The other is called Speech and Morality, on the Metaethical Implications of Speaking. As we get into the material of this first week, you might be tempted to think that something like moral realism is just common sense, kind of a no-brainer. And I don't think you'd be entirely wrong, but I do want to encourage you to take this matter seriously and not treat it like it's a no-brainer. Especially if you want to be an effective apologist, you have to take on some of these challenges and consider the evidence that might point in various directions. And this question about moral foundations, about moral realism, is a question that will come up more and more in years to come. And so it really does behoove us to be prepared to address it intelligently and respectfully. There are 3 main metaethical rivals to realism, and I want to talk about one of them in particular in this particular video. When I say metaethical, you might wonder what that means. Ethics is usually divided into 3 parts: applied ethics, normative ethics, and metaethics. And I'll quickly define each of these. So applied ethics deals with specific and concrete questions, like the rightness or wrongness of something like, say, euthanasia or abortion or what have you, or the ethical questions that arise in a particular field like business ethics or medicine or journalism. Normative ethics deals with the nature of rightness and wrongness, and sometimes it's expanded to include matters of virtue and vice as well. Normative ethics tends to presuppose there are such things as right and wrong. Then metaethics is sort of the most theoretical part of ethics of all, and it asks most fundamentally whether there are any moral facts in the first place. And it ranges over matters of moral semantics, pertaining to what various moral words mean, like the word ought or right or what have you. It talks about moral epistemology. This is the matter of whether we have moral knowledge. Moral rationality, what's the connection between morality and rationality? And moral ontology or metaphysics, pertaining to moral facts, if there are these facts. So as I say, there are 3 main metaethical rivals to moral realism: error theory, expressivism, and constructivism. And these theories give rather different answers, both from each other and from moral realism, to the question of whether there are moral facts, and if there are, what they are like. And so we're going to be talking in this video about error theory. And in terms of expressivism and constructivism and realism itself, it's really important that you read very carefully the pages devoted to these topics by C. Stephen Evans, okay? Okay, now the best known error theorist is J.L. Mackie, and he laid out his views on this question in a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. By the way, more recently, Richard Joyce has become a vocal proponent of error theory, but we're going to talk about Mackie by and large, who thought that we had to invent morality because it cannot be discovered. Why? Well, because, as Mackie put it, there are no objective values. Okay, now error theorists think that there is a major mistake at the heart of all moral thought and discourse. Their central idea is this: that in holding and expressing moral views, we are trying to believe and state the truth about what is morally right or wrong, good or bad, but there is no such truth. So our moral views, no matter how considered or nuanced or passionate, are mistaken, all of them. They are always in error because there are no moral facts. There are 3 central claims, then, of error theory, and we can put it this way. 1, our moral judgments aim to represent moral facts. 2, there are no moral facts. And so 3, none of our moral judgments are true. Our moral judgments are descriptive judgments. When we make moral judgments, we express our belief that certain actions, motives, traits, and so on possess certain moral features. We are trying to state the truth, to represent reality and accurately describe the situations we encounter or contemplate. But if there are no moral facts, then all such judgments are bound to fail in what they set out to do. They are true just in case the subjects of such judgments really possess the moral features that are attributed to them. So they are never true, because no moral facts await our accurate description. J.L. Mackie gives 5 reasons to adopt error theory, starting with the argument from relativity. The argument from relativity goes like this. Moral beliefs and practices vary widely throughout the world and throughout history. This is an empirical claim. And the question he then raised was this: on what thesis is this more surprising, error theory or moral realism? And he thought that persistent moral differences make less sense on moral realism. Error theory is the better explanation of the moral diversity and disagreements that we find than moral realism is. We have simply adopted certain ways of life. We first end up accepting certain values, and then we gradually come to think of them as objectively true, but we're mistaken. What about Mackie's second reason? Well, as it happens, his reasons number 2, number 3, and number 4 are connected with what he calls the argument from queerness. And by queerness, he simply means like oddness. So moving on to Mackie's second reason, consider his argument from queerness. It has 2 parts, a metaphysical part and an epistemic part. And the metaphysical part has 2 parts, and they are these, and I'll call them A and B. A, the metaphysical peculiarity of the supposed objective values, in that they would have to be intrinsically action guiding and motivating. And I'll explain what I mean by that more in a moment. And then B, the problem of how such values could supervene on natural features, And you can think of supervenience in general terms as kind of an airtight connection of one sort or another. So let's consider each in turn. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at A, the metaphysical peculiarity of the supposed objective values. We'll consider that in a moment, that first metaphysical part of the argument from queerness. And then we'll consider B, that supervenience issue, and that will be the third reason. And then the fourth reason will be the epistemic part of the argument from queerness. And that's what we'll cover in these next 3 slides, these 3. So reason number 2 is A, reason number 3 is B, reason number 4 is the epistemic aspect of the argument from queerness. Okay, so reason number 2 is the first metaphysical part of the argument from queerness. The metaphysical peculiarity of the supposed objective values, in that they would have to be intrinsically action guiding and motivating. Now, another word for this quality is that objective moral values would have a mysterious sort of authority, binding authority over us. And Mackie thought that this odd feature would make moral values most unlikely to exist. Mackie's third reason for adopting error theory is his second metaphysical point under the argument from queerness. And this is the problem of how objective moral values can supervene on natural features. So take the physical property of having set fire to a cat. Such a thing is morally bad, if not downright evil. And that's a moral property. Well, how is it that that moral property supervenes on the physical property. Mackie thought it unlikely that we can generate a good story as to how. Mackie's fourth reason for adopting error theory is the epistemic part of the queerness problem. And so the question here becomes, how can such objective moral values be known, even if they do exist? Mackie seemed to think that the moral objectivist or realist would have to be committed to our possessing a special faculty of moral apprehension, a sort of moral intuition. And Mackie considered this to be a lame answer, kind of an epistemically indulgent, unlikely sort of scenario. But how else can we become aware of the authoritative prescriptivity of morality? None of our ordinary ways of knowing suffices, he says. Not sensory perception, not introspection, not confirmation of explanatory hypotheses, not logical construction, not conceptual analysis, not any combination of those. Mackie's fifth reason for adopting error theory comes about as he considers why people still believe in objective moral values, even if there are not objective moral values. And his answer is basically they're conditioned to do so, and they project their attitudes into the world, and they desire their moral judgments to be binding on others, and so forth, but all of which is consistent with there being no objective moral values. So he thinks he can explain why people still retain these beliefs despite the non-existence of objective moral values. And so you put it all together, and Mackie considered all of these 5 reasons to be good reasons to be error theorists. Moral realism, he thought, simply introduced too many problems to contend with. By way of summary, then, Mackie offered 5 reasons to reject objective morality. The first was a relativity argument, then 3 considerations based on the odd features of morality, and the 5th reason was his account for why people stubbornly cling to notions of moral objectivity, despite that doing so is a mistake. His relativity argument is based on the widely fluctuating moral beliefs and practices throughout the world and history, which he thought is better accounted for by moral skepticism than by moral realism. What I'd like for us to do is consider his second, third, and fourth reasons, though. Let's zero in on this oddness or queerness issue. Now, the first 2 ways that he thought morality are odd are metaphysical. One was that morality would have to be binding and authoritative apart from our own desires and preferences, and the other that morality would have to derive somehow from natural features of the world. The third sense of moral oddness pertained to the challenge of accounting for moral knowledge, since the idea of a specific moral sense seems unlikely. And here's how I'd like to handle this. Let's ask, might theism, God himself, help answer this set of questions that Mackie raises? What is of considerable interest is the way in which theism provides potentially quite good answers to all 3 of these challenges that Mackie raises pertaining to oddness. Take, by turns, the 3 objections to moral realism based on its alleged queerness or oddness. How do we account for the authority of morality? How do we account for the way in which moral features emerge from natural features? And how do we account for moral knowledge? As I'm going to try to show you here in the next few moments, theism seems to help immensely with each point. Interestingly, Mackie himself admitted that God, if he existed, would be relevant to each of these challenges. On the score of the authority of morality, for example, he conceded that God would add something to morality, namely, and these are Mackie's words, quote, an objectively prescriptive element to what otherwise were hard descriptive truths, but in a quite non-mysterious way. These would be literally commands issued by an identifiable authority. What about accounting for the way in which moral features emerge from natural features? Again, Mackie, this time from another one of his books called The Miracle of Theism, saw theism as a potential solution. In a rather famous passage, he actually wrote this: intrinsically prescriptive features, supervening upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen without an all-powerful God to create them. If, then, there are such intrinsically prescriptive objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. On the matter of moral knowledge, once more consider Mackie's own words, and I quote, "Men cannot by observation and experiment discover exactly what life is ultimately most satisfying for them. But given that God knows this, desires that they should so live, and has somehow revealed corresponding explicit instructions to them, men can reasonably resort to such revelations to infer this indirectly, so as to complete their determination of this required and ultimately satisfying life." Now again, Mackie himself did not believe in God, but he was imagining, what if God did exist? And he realized that if God did exist, it would address this issue quite handily as well. Now, all of this has been rather hasty, but for now I simply wanted to gesture at an intriguing possibility that the real import of Mackie's arguments, once you understand them, may well not be so much a case against objective ethics or a case in favor of error theory as the sort of positive case for God that elsewhere he had said he thought he never found. More minimally, it seems a question-begging exercise to take his considerations as decisive evidence against moral realism because it seems to presuppose the irrelevance of theism as a potential solution.